The Utah 2021 cold case that shook Moab to its core was finally solved, but the arrest revelation would shock the entire community. Kylen Schulte and Crystal Turner were living their best life in August 2021, two women deeply in love, camping under desert stars and working side by side in the Red Rock paradise they called home. But after mentioning a creepy guy near their campsite during drinks with friends on August 13th, they vanished without a trace. 5 days later, their bodies were discovered at their mountain retreat, shot multiple times in what appeared to be a senseless execution. For 9 long months, their families fought for answers while the investigation went cold. Then, in May 2022, detectives named their killer, Adam Pinkushevitz, a former co-worker who had confessed to someone before taking his own life. But how did a man who worked alongside them become their murderer, and why did it take so long to connect the dots? Before we get into the story, drop a comment with your country and the time right now. The desert morning sun painted Moab's red cliffs in shades of fire as Kylen Schulte and Crystal Turner walked hand in hand down Main Street. Their laughter carried on the warm August breeze, mixing with the distant hum of tourists and locals starting another day in paradise. Kylen's wild, curly hair caught the light as she turned to kiss Crystal's cheek, their love as natural as breathing. "We should grab more ice for the cooler," Crystal said, her practical mind already planning their weekend camping trip. Her calloused mechanic's hands squeezed Kylen's fingers gently. At 38, she had learned to cherish simple moments like these. "And marshmallows," Kylen added with a grin that could melt snow. At 24, she still found wonder in everything. The way shadows moved across canyon walls, the sound wind made through pine trees, the feeling of Crystal's hand in hers. They stopped at the local grocery store, their familiar faces earning warm greetings from cashiers and fellow shoppers. Moab was small enough that everyone knew everyone, especially a couple as devoted as these two. Their van sat parked outside, already loaded with camping gear, sleeping bags, cooking supplies, and the hammock they loved to share under starlit skies. "You two heading up to the mountains again?" asked Martha, the elderly store clerk who had watched them grow into the couple everyone in town admired. "Our favorite spot in the La Salles," Crystal replied, loading groceries into their reusable bags. "Can't beat the view up there." The afternoon slipped away as they finished preparations, their small apartment filled with the organized chaos of packing. Kylen folded clothes, while Crystal checked their camping stove and headlamps. Everything had its place, everything had purpose. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, they loaded the last of their supplies and headed for the mountains. Woody's Tavern buzzed with the familiar energy of a Friday night in Moab. The local bar served as unofficial community center where tourists mixed with longtime residents over cold beers and shared stories. Kylen and Crystal claimed their usual corner booth, surrounded by friends who had gathered to celebrate another week's end. "To another weekend in paradise," called out Sean, one of Kylen's co-workers from the local shop where she crafted jewelry and art pieces. He raised his beer in salute as others joined the toast. Crystal smiled, her usually quiet demeanor softening in the warmth of friendship. These Friday gatherings had become ritual, a way to connect with the community that had embraced them both. She worked at a local auto shop, her skills with engines earning respect from even the most skeptical old-timers. As the evening wore on, conversation flowed from work, gossip to weekend plans. Kylen shared stories about a difficult customer, while Crystal quietly listened, occasionally adding dry comments that sent the table into laughter. Their dynamic was easy, comfortable. Crystal the steady anchor, Kylen the bright flame. "You know," Kylen said, her expression growing slightly serious, "there's been this creepy guy hanging around our campsite lately. Kinda gives me the shivers." "What kind of creepy?" asked Jessica, another friend who worked at the local outfitter shop. "Just watching us. Doesn't say much, but he's there more often than feels normal. Makes Crystal nervous too." Crystal nodded, her protective instincts always alert. "I told her we should maybe find a different spot for a while." "Nah." Kylen waved off the concern with characteristic optimism. "It's probably nothing. Our spot is too beautiful to give up for some weirdo." The friends laughed and moved on to lighter topics, but the comment lingered in the air like smoke. As the night wound down around 10 p.m., Kylen and Crystal said their goodbyes, promising to share photos from their weekend adventure. They walked to their van under stars that seemed close enough to touch, the mountain air already calling them home. Saturday morning brought silence where there should have been the familiar ping of text messages. Jessica stared at her phone in the parking lot of the coffee shop where she and Kylen often met for weekend breakfast. She had sent 3 messages, casual check-ins about their camping trip, but the blue bubbles remained unread. "That's weird," she muttered, trying Kylen's number again. It went straight to voicemail, Kylen's cheerful voice promising to call back soon. Crystal's phone did the same thing. Up in the Sal Mountains, their van sat quiet among towering pines. Morning mist clung to the forest floor, and somewhere in the distance a jay called repeatedly. The hammock hung empty between 2 trees, swaying slightly in the breeze. Their camping chairs remained positioned around a cold fire ring, as if waiting for their owners to return with morning coffee. A fellow camper walking his dog noticed the stillness. The van's windows showed no movement, no signs of life inside. He paused, uncertain. People camped at different rhythms. Some rose with dawn, others slept until noon. But something felt off about the absolute quiet surrounding the site. Back in town, Jessica's unease grew as the day progressed. She knew Kylen's habits well enough to recognize when something wasn't right. Kylen was religiously responsive to texts, especially on weekends when she had time to chat. Crystal was more reserved with her phone, but she would have made sure Kylen replied to friends. By afternoon, Jessica had called several mutual friends. Sean hadn't heard from them either. Neither had the group from last night's gathering at Woody's. A knot of worry began forming in Jessica's stomach as the sun started its descent toward evening. "I'm going to drive up there tomorrow morning if I don't hear from them," she told Sean over the phone. "Something's not right. Kylen wouldn't just disappear like this." The mountains held their secrets as another night fell over Moab, and 2 phones lay silent in the darkness. Monday morning brought harsh reality crashing down on the small community. Neither Kylen nor Crystal had shown up for work, and their employer's concern quickly transformed into alarm. At the jewelry shop where Kylen crafted her pieces, her manager stared at the empty workstation where colorful beads and wire waited for hands that wouldn't return. "She's never missed a day without calling," the manager told Jessica when she stopped by during lunch. "Not once in 2 years. Something's wrong." At the auto shop, Crystal's boss echoed the same sentiment. Her tools hung neatly in their designated spots, her work coveralls folded on the bench where she'd left them Friday afternoon. Crystal was the most reliable employee he'd ever had. Punctual, dedicated, never absent without notice. Word spread quickly through Moab's tight network of friendships and professional relationships. By afternoon, a group had assembled at Jessica's apartment to coordinate search efforts. Maps of the Sal Mountains covered her kitchen table, marked with red circles around known camping areas. "We need to check their usual spots first," suggested Sean, running his finger along hiking trails they all knew well. "They have maybe 3 or 4 places they rotate between." The group divided into pairs, each taking different access roads into the mountains. Cell service was spotty in the high country, so they agreed to meet back at Jessica's by sunset to compare findings. As they prepared to leave, each person carried the same heavy feeling that they were looking for their friends, but hoping not to find them. The first search team found nothing at Kylen and Crystal's second favorite camping area. The second team came back empty-handed from a spot near Mill Creek. But as darkness approached and the final team hadn't returned, phones began ringing with increasingly frantic calls. Jessica paced her apartment, checking her phone every few minutes. Outside, Moab continued its normal evening rhythm: tourists heading to dinner, locals stopping by the grocery store, teenagers gathering in parking lots. But for a growing circle of friends and family, the world had narrowed to one terrifying question: where were Kylen and Crystal? Tuesday brought organized desperation. Jessica's apartment had transformed overnight into an impromptu command center, her dining table covered with missing person flyers featuring photos of Kylen and Crystal smiling at the camera. The images captured everything about them: Kylen's infectious joy, Crystal's quiet strength, the obvious love between them. Marie McCann worked steadily at the table, her maternal instincts channeling grief into action. As Kylen's stepmother, she had helped raise the free-spirited young woman from teenager to adult, and watching her flourish with Crystal had been one of life's greatest joys. Now she folded flyers with mechanical precision, each crease a small act of faith that someone, somewhere, had seen them. "We need these at every business in town," she said, her voice steady despite the tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. "Gas stations, restaurants, hotels. Someone must have seen them after Friday night." Lyle McCann stood by the window, his weathered hands gripping a coffee cup that had long since gone cold. Kylen's father had spent decades working outdoors, his body tough from physical labor and desert Sunday, but nothing had prepared him for this kind of helplessness. He stared toward the mountains where his daughter might be hurt, might be scared, might be calling for help that couldn't reach her. "I should be up there looking," he said for the dozenth time. "The search teams are covering more ground than we could alone," Marie replied gently, though her own instinct was to tear through every canyon and forest until she found them. Friends took stacks of flyers to tape on windows and bulletin boards throughout Moab. The photos multiplied across the town like a spreading plea. 2 women who had brought light to everyone they met, now vanished into the vast wilderness they loved so much. As evening approached, Lyle's phone rang with updates from volunteer searchers. Each call brought the same result: nothing. No sign of the van, no trace of a campsite, no clue about what had happened to 2 people who seemed to have simply evaporated. The stars came out over Moab as they had every night for millions of years, but tonight they felt different, distant, and cold, keeping their secrets locked in darkness. Wednesday's dawn brought phone calls that shattered the last fragments of hope. Family members throughout Utah and beyond learned that Kylen and Crystal were missing, their voices breaking as they processed the impossible news. In her Colorado home, Crystal's mother clutched the phone receiver until her knuckles turned white, demanding answers that no one could give. "How do two people just disappear?" she asked, through tears, the question echoing in hearts across 2 states. Lyle spent the pre-dawn hours on his porch, staring toward the Sal Mountains, silhouetted against the lightening sky. Sleep had become impossible, replaced by an endless loop of worst-case scenarios that his mind refused to stop playing. He thought about Kylen as a little girl, her fearless approach to climbing trees and exploring creek beds. She had never met a wilderness she couldn't navigate, never encountered outdoor challenges that intimidated her. But the wilderness was vast, and even experienced outdoors enthusiasts could face situations beyond their control. Weather could change without warning, equipment could fail, people could get hurt in places where help couldn't reach them quickly enough. Marie moved through the house like a ghost, straightening things that didn't need straightening, cooking meals that no one would eat. Her hands needed tasks to keep her sane, but her heart felt like it was tearing apart with each passing hour. She kept expecting the phone to ring with good news, Kylen's voice explaining some simple misunderstanding that had kept them out of contact. By evening, the volunteer search efforts had covered dozens of square miles without finding any trace. Professional search and rescue teams were being contacted for more systematic coverage of the mountain wilderness. The reality was settling in like cold fog. This wasn't a simple case of friends losing track of time on a camping trip. As night fell over Moab once more, families on both sides prepared for another sleepless night of waiting, praying, and trying to hold on to hope that grew more fragile with each passing hour. Thursday morning, August 18th, broke clear and cold in the high country as Jessica and Sean made one final attempt to locate their missing friends. They had barely slept, kept awake by the gnawing certainty that something terrible had happened. Armed with detailed maps and emergency supplies, they headed up the winding forest roads toward areas that hadn't been thoroughly searched. "Try this turnoff," Jessica said, pointing to a narrow dirt road that branched toward a known camping area. Her voice was hoarse from 3 days of coordinating search efforts and making countless phone calls. The forest seemed different this morning, too quiet, too still. Even the birds appeared subdued, their calls muffled by dense pine boughs. Sean navigated carefully over rocks and ruts, both of them scanning the trees for any flash of color that might indicate human presence. Then they saw it. The van sat exactly where it should be, positioned in a small clearing that offered privacy and mountain views. For a split second, relief flooded through both searchers. They had found them. Everything would be okay. But as they approached, the relief curdled into horror. The van's doors hung open, camping gear lay scattered across the ground, and beyond the vehicle, in positions that made no sense for sleeping campers, were 2 still forms that had once been vibrant, loving human beings. Jessica's scream cut through the forest silence like a knife. Sean fumbled for his phone, his hands shaking so badly he could barely dial 911. The operator's calm voice seemed to come from another world as he tried to explain what they had found, where they were, what help was needed. Within hours, the quiet camping spot transformed into a crime scene. Yellow tape fluttered between pine trees like grotesque party streamers. Police vehicles wound up the narrow mountain road, their radios crackling with official language that couldn't begin to capture the magnitude of loss. Kylen Schulte and Crystal Turner were dead. Their love story ended by violence in the place they had felt safest. The mountains that had held their secrets now gave them up, but only began new questions about who could have done this, and why. News of the murders spread through Moab like wildfire on a drought-stricken hillside. By evening, the entire town seemed to be holding its breath, processing the incomprehensible reality that 2 beloved community members had been killed in their sleep. Local businesses closed early as people gathered in small groups, sharing memories and trying to make sense of senseless violence. At the corner of Main Street and Center, someone had already created an impromptu memorial. Flowers appeared first, wildflowers picked from roadside ditches, roses purchased from the local grocery store, carefully tended garden blooms brought from home. Then came the candles, dozens of them in glass holders that would protect flames from desert wind. Marie McCann stood before the growing tribute, her face etched with the particular devastation that comes when worse fears are confirmed. She held a framed photograph of Kylen and Crystal from happier times, a selfie they'd taken during a hiking trip, their faces glowing with the kind of joy that seemed permanent and unshakable. They were supposed to grow old together, she whispered to Jessica, who stood beside her with tears streaming down her face. They had so many plans. Lyle remained apart from the crowd, his grief too raw and overwhelming for public displays. He leaned against his truck in the parking lot, staring at the memorial but unable to approach it. The flowers and candles were beautiful, but they represented finality he wasn't ready to accept. As full darkness settled over Moab, the candles created a warm glow that could be seen from blocks away. People continued arriving throughout the evening, co-workers, customers who remembered their kindness, fellow members of the LGBTQ+ community who had found inspiration in their open, committed relationship. The vigil lasted until nearly midnight, voices sharing stories about encounters with Kylen and Crystal that had brightened ordinary days. In the flickering candlelight, their faces seemed to dance in the photographs, smiling at friends who would carry their memory forward into an uncertain future. But even as the community came together in grief, questions lurked in the shadows. Someone had murdered 2 innocent people, someone had destroyed lives and shattered sense of safety, and that someone was still out there, unknown and dangerous. The Grand County Sheriff's Office transformed overnight into the nerve center of a major criminal investigation. Detective Sal Mountains arrived before dawn on Friday, her experienced eyes taking in the evidence board that would soon dominate the main conference room. Photographs from the crime scene were already pinned in precise rows, each image a piece of a puzzle that seemed to have no clear starting point. "What do we know so far?" she asked the deputy, who had been first to respond to Sean's emergency call. 2 victims, both shot multiple times. No signs of robbery, their wallets, phones, and camping equipment were untouched. No evidence of sexual assault. The killer used their van to position the bodies, then left everything exactly where it fell. Martinez studied the crime scene photos with the methodical attention that had solved dozens of cases over her 15-year career. The positioning of the bodies suggested the killer had surprised them while they slept. The multiple gunshot wounds indicated either panic or rage, possibly both. Any witnesses in the area? We're canvassing all known camping sites within a 5-mile radius. So far, 3 separate parties remember seeing the victim's van on Thursday evening, but no one recalls hearing gunshots. The forest can muffle sound pretty effectively. The evidence bags were arranged on a separate table like macabre artifacts, cell phones that had stopped receiving messages 3 days ago, clothing that would be analyzed for DNA and fiber evidence, shell casings that might provide ballistic fingerprints. Each item represented hope that science and careful investigation could speak for victims who would never tell their own story. By afternoon, the sheriff's office had established a timeline. Kylen and Crystal were last seen alive leaving Woody's Tavern around 10 p.m. on Friday, August 13th. Their bodies were discovered Wednesday morning, August 18th. Somewhere in that 5-day window, someone had approached their isolated campsite and committed double murder. The investigation board grew throughout the day as deputies interviewed friends, co-workers, and family members. Each conversation added detail to the victim's final days, but also raised new questions about who might have wanted to hurt 2 women who seemed to have no enemies in the world. By August 25th, the FBI had joined the investigation, bringing federal resources and expertise to bear on a case that had captivated national attention. Special Agent Robert Chen arrived in Moab with a team of specialists in ballistics, forensic psychology, and digital forensics, their black SUVs adding an ominous note to the small town's already anxious atmosphere. "We're treating this as a potential hate crime," Chen explained during his first briefing with local law enforcement. The victims were a same-sex couple in a conservative region. The isolation of the crime scene suggests premeditation. The overkill pattern indicates strong emotional motivation. Detective Martinez appreciated the federal assistance, but worried about the implication. If this was indeed a hate crime, the killer might target other LGBTQ+ individuals in the community. Several local couples had already changed their routines, avoiding isolated areas where they had previously felt safe. The expanded investigation cast a wider net, examining the victim's online presence for potential threats or harassment. Crystal's social media posts revealed a quiet pride in her relationship, sharing photos of mountain adventures and anniversary celebrations. Kylen's accounts showed a more exuberant approach, filled with heart emojis and declarations of love that had drawn both support and occasional negative comments from strangers. "Look at this," said FBI technician Maria Santos, pointing to her computer screen. Someone left a particularly nasty comment on one of Kylen's Instagram posts from June. The language is pretty threatening. The team traced the comment to an account that had since been deactivated, but digital forensics experts began the painstaking process of identifying the user behind the deleted profile. Meanwhile, ballistics experts confirmed that the shell casings found at the scene came from a common caliber handgun, the type owned by thousands of people throughout Utah. As the investigation expanded, so did the media attention. News vans appeared on Moab's main street, reporters conducting interviews with anyone willing to talk about the victims. The small town struggled to balance its desire for justice with growing concerns about privacy and safety. Local businesses reported a noticeable decline in tourism as news of the murders spread beyond Utah. Moab's economy depended heavily on visitors who came for outdoor recreation, but double murder in a remote camping area was exactly the kind of story that made families reconsider vacation plans. September brought an unsettling paranoia to Moab that settled over the town like a persistent fog. Conversations in coffee shops and grocery stores invariably turned to the murders, with residents eyeing strangers with new suspicion and local couples avoiding their usual camping spots. The sense of safety that had defined small-town life had evaporated, replaced by an anxiety that made people lock doors that had never needed locking. "I don't even like walking to my car alone after work," admitted Sarah, a waitress at one of the local restaurants. "It could be anyone. It could be someone we all know." The investigation had generated dozens of tips from community members, each requiring careful follow-up by already stretched law enforcement resources. A suspicious character seen near the mountains, a vehicle that didn't belong in the area, unusual behavior from a neighbor or coworker. Most tips led nowhere, but detectives couldn't afford to dismiss any potential lead. Local gun shops reported increased sales as residents sought ways to protect themselves. Hardware stores couldn't keep security lights and motion sensors in stock. The outdoor recreation community that formed Moab's social backbone began organizing group camping trips, unwilling to abandon the wilderness but afraid to venture into it alone. "This isn't the Moab I moved here for," said longtime resident Tom Watson, who had relocated from Phoenix for the small-town atmosphere and outdoor lifestyle. "We're turning into the kind of place people move away from." The victims' families struggled with their own forms of paranoia, wondering if they too might be targets of whoever had killed their daughters. Lyle installed new deadbolts and security cameras at his home, though he couldn't shake the feeling that no amount of protection would be enough against someone capable of such calculated violence. Marie found herself checking and rechecking locks throughout the day, her maternal instincts now hyper-vigilant for threats that could come from anywhere. Sleep became elusive as her mind replayed endless scenarios of danger and loss. The weekly gatherings at Woody's Tavern grew smaller and quieter. Friends who had once shared easy laughter now found conversations strained by the weight of loss and fear. Even in the company of trusted friends, shadows seemed longer and silence felt threatening. October's memorial service filled the community center beyond capacity, with mourners spilling onto the lawn and sidewalk outside. The service celebrated lives that had been brutally cut short, but had left indelible marks on everyone they touched. Photos displayed around the room showed Kylen and Crystal at their best hiking together, working on community projects, sharing quiet moments that radiated contentment and love. Lyle stood at the podium with hands that shook slightly as he unfolded his prepared remarks. Public speaking had never come easily to him, but grief demanded expression that could only come through shared words and communal mourning. "Kylen found joy in everything," he began, his voice breaking slightly on his daughter's name. "She could make art from scraps, find beauty in broken things, and see the best in people who couldn't see it in themselves. Crystal gave her stability and brought out her strength. Together, they were better than either could be alone." Marie spoke about the Crystal she had come to know and love, the young woman who had helped Kylen bloom into her fullest self. She was quiet, but when Crystal spoke, people listened. She fixed things that were broken: cars, appliances, and I think maybe hearts too. She fixed Kylen's heart and Kylen fixed hers. Friends shared memories that painted pictures of two lives well lived despite being too brief. Stories about late-night philosophical discussions, impromptu road trips, and the way they supported each other through challenges. Their co-workers talked about their dedication and kindness. Their customers remembered their patience and skill. The service concluded with a release of biodegradable lanterns, each one carrying written messages to the victims. As dozens of lights rose into the October darkness, they looked like stars being born, brief, brilliant, and beautiful. The crowd stood in silence, watching until the last lantern disappeared beyond the mountains. But even in the midst of celebration and remembrance, the unanswered questions cast shadows over the gathering. 2 months had passed since the murders, and the investigation seemed no closer to identifying a suspect. Justice felt as distant as the fading lanterns, and some mourners wondered if answers would ever come. Winter settled over the investigation like snow over abandoned camps, muffling sounds and obscuring details that had once seemed clear. Detective Martinez stared at the evidence board that had grown to cover an entire wall of the conference room, its maze of photographs, timelines, and connecting strings representing hundreds of hours of work that had yielded frustratingly little progress. The case file had swollen to multiple boxes containing witness statements, forensic reports, and background checks on dozens of potential suspects. Each lead had been followed to its logical conclusion, most ending in dead ends that led nowhere. The ballistics evidence confirmed the weapon type but not the specific gun. DNA analysis had found nothing useful from the crime scene. Digital forensics had traced the threatening online comment to a fake account that couldn't be definitively linked to any individual. "We're missing something," Martinez told Agent Chen during their weekly review meeting. Two people don't just get murdered in their sleep without someone seeing something, hearing something, knowing something. The FBI's behavioral analysis had created a profile of the likely perpetrator, a male with knowledge of the local area, possibly someone who had encountered the victims before, driven by personal grievance or ideological hatred. The profile fit dozens of people in the region, but provided no clear path to a specific suspect. Local tips had dwindled from several per day to maybe one per week, usually from well-meaning residents reporting suspicious activity that turned out to be perfectly innocent. The media attention had largely moved on to other stories, leaving the investigation to proceed in the shadows of public indifference. For the victims' families, the lack of progress felt like a second death, this time of hope itself. Lyle had taken to driving past the sheriff's office daily, not stopping but somehow needing to see that the investigation continued. Marie maintained a meticulous calendar marking each day that passed without answers, her faith in justice slowly eroding under the weight of institutional limitations. The approaching holidays brought additional pain as families prepared for celebrations that would forever be marked by absence. 2 chairs would remain empty, 2 voices would be missing from conversations, 2 futures had been stolen by someone who remained free and anonymous. March 2022 brought an unexpected breakthrough that arrived not through sophisticated forensic analysis or federal investigative techniques, but through the simple human need to unburden a guilty conscience. A former acquaintance of Adam Pinkusewicz contacted the sheriff's office with information that had been weighing on him for months. "I should have called sooner," the man said during his recorded interview, his voice shaky with anxiety and regret. "Adam told me something last fall, right before he left town. I didn't think much of it at the time, thought he was just talking crazy like he sometimes did. But after I saw the news about those 2 women," Detective Martinez leaned forward, her instincts suddenly alert. After months of false leads and dead ends, something in the witness's tone suggested this might be different. "What did he tell you exactly?" "He said he'd killed them, the 2 women who were camping, said it like he was talking about the weather, just matter of fact. I thought he was making it up, trying to sound tough or something. Adam always talked big, you know? But he knew details about it that weren't in the papers." The investigation pivoted immediately toward Adam Pinkusewicz, a name that had appeared peripherally in the case file as someone who had worked briefly with both victims at local businesses. He was described by former co-workers as withdrawn and unpredictable, the kind of person who made others uncomfortable without being able to articulate why. Within days, investigators had constructed a timeline that placed Adam in the area during the relevant time period. He had left Moab suddenly in late August 2021, shortly after the bodies were discovered, claiming he needed to find work elsewhere. Several witnesses recalled his odd behavior in the days following the murders, including inappropriate comments about the victims and an unusual interest in following news coverage of the investigation. The breakthrough energized the entire investigative team, but also brought sobering news. Adam had died by suicide in a different state several months earlier, taking whatever full confession he might have made to his grave. There would be no arrest, no trial, no opportunity for families to confront their loved one's killer in court. April brought intensive investigation into Adam Pinkusewicz's background and movements, as detectives worked to build a circumstantial case that could officially close the murders without the benefit of a living suspect. Every aspect of his life came under scrutiny: employment records, financial transactions, vehicle registrations, and interviews with anyone who had encountered him during his final months. The picture that emerged was of a deeply troubled individual who had struggled to maintain stable employment and relationships throughout his adult life. Former co-workers described him as competent but volatile, prone to sudden outbursts of anger and inappropriate comments about violence. Several women recalled feeling uncomfortable around him, though none had reported specific threats or harassment. "He had this way of looking at people that made your skin crawl," said one former supervisor. "Like he was thinking things he shouldn't be thinking. We never had complaints he could be fired for, but nobody wanted to work shifts alone with him." Financial records revealed that Adam had purchased ammunition consistent with the crime scene evidence just days before the murders. Cell phone tower data, though not conclusive, suggested his device had been in the general area of the Sal Mountains during the relevant time frame. His sudden departure from Moab immediately after the bodies were discovered now seemed less like coincidence and more like flight from consequences. The investigation also revealed that Adam had previously encountered both victims in professional setting. He had briefly worked at the auto shop where Crystal was employed and had been a customer at the store where Kylen sold her handcrafted jewelry. These interactions, described by witnesses as tense and uncomfortable, suggested a pattern of escalating resentment that might have motivated the murders. Crystal's former supervisor remembered having to speak with Adam about his behavior around female employees. He would stand too close, make comments that weren't quite harassment but made everyone uncomfortable. Crystal handled it professionally, but I could tell he bothered her. The jewelry store owner recalled Adam's visits as awkward and prolonged, with him spending excessive time browsing without purchasing anything. Kylen was always polite to customers, but she mentioned he gave her weird vibes. She said he asked too many personal questions about her life and relationship. Detective Martinez began constructing a timeline that showed Adam's increasing presence in the victims' orbits during the weeks leading up to their deaths. Security camera footage from local businesses confirmed his presence in town on multiple occasions when he claimed to have been elsewhere. The emerging pattern suggested premeditation rather than random violence. May 12, 2022 marked the day that nearly 9 months of investigation culminated in a press conference that would finally provide answers to a grieving community. Sheriff Stephen White stood before a room packed with reporters, family members, and community leaders, his expression grave as he prepared to announce the resolution of Moab's most devastating crime. After extensive investigation involving local, state, and federal resources, we have identified the person responsible for the murders of Kylen Schulte and Crystal Turner, he began, his voice carrying the weight of months of painstaking work. Adam Pinkushevitz, age 42, has been determined to be the perpetrator of these crimes. The room erupted with questions, but Sheriff White continued with the details that families had waited nearly a year to hear. Mr. Pinkushevitz confessed to these murders to an acquaintance before taking his own life in September 2021. Physical evidence and witness testimony corroborate this confession and establish his presence in the area during the time of the murders. Lyle McCann sat in the front row, his weathered hands gripping the armrests of his chair so tightly his knuckles had turned white. The news brought no satisfaction, only a hollow confirmation of what he had suspected, that someone had deliberately ended his daughter's life for reasons that would never make sense. Marie wept quietly beside him, her tears mixing relief with frustration. After months of wondering and waiting, they finally had a name and face to attach to their nightmare. But Adam's death meant there would be no trial, no opportunity to hear his explanation, no chance for justice to be served in any traditional sense. We believe Mr. Pinkushevitz harbored resentment toward the victims based on previous encounters in workplace settings. Sheriff White continued, the evidence suggests this was a planned attack motivated by personal grievance, possibly with elements of bias against the victim's relationship. Agent Chen added details about the federal investigation's findings, confirming that hate crime charges would have been pursued if the suspect had survived. The confession, combined with physical evidence and behavioral analysis, left no doubt about Adam's guilt. The press conference lasted nearly an hour, with officials answering questions about investigative methods, evidence collection, and the challenges of prosecuting a case where the suspect was no longer alive. For the families and community members present, each detail was another piece of closure they hadn't realized they needed. The aftermath of the press conference brought complex emotions that couldn't be easily categorized as relief or satisfaction. Throughout Moab, people processed the news that their fears had been justified. Someone they had known, worked alongside, encountered in daily life, had been capable of such deliberate evil. The revelation that Adam had lived among them after committing murder was particularly unsettling. He was at the memorial service, Jessica realized with horror, remembering seeing Adam's face in the crowd that had gathered to honor Kylen and Crystal. He stood there with the rest of us, pretending to mourn people he had killed. The suicide note Adam had left behind, retrieved from police files in the state where he died, contained cryptic references to mistakes and things that couldn't be undone, but offered no clear explanation for his actions. Mental health professionals who reviewed the document found evidence of severe psychological disturbance but no coherent motive that could provide families with the understanding they craved. Lyle struggled with rage that had no outlet, fury directed at a man who would never face consequences for destroying so many lives. He took the coward's way out, he said to Marie, as they sat in their kitchen surrounded by nearly a year's worth of newspaper clippings and investigation updates. He took my daughter, and then he took my chance to look him in the eye and ask him why. Marie's grief had evolved into something more complex, a mixture of closure and continuing loss that would define the rest of her life. At least we know it wasn't random, she said quietly. At least we know someone didn't just pick them because they were camping alone. It doesn't make it better, but it makes it different. Crystal's mother, speaking by phone from Colorado, expressed similar conflicted feelings. I wanted him to pay for what he did, but I also wanted to understand why he did it. Now I'll never get either one. The community response was equally mixed, with some residents expressing relief that the killer was no longer a threat, while others struggled with the knowledge that they had been unknowingly vulnerable for months after the murders. The revelation raised uncomfortable questions about how well anyone truly knew their neighbors and co-workers. August 18, 2022 marked the official closing of the case file on the murders of Kylen Schulte and Crystal Turner. Detective Martinez placed the final reports in the boxes that would be stored in the Sheriff's Department's evidence room, each document representing countless hours of work by dozens of investigators who had refused to give up on finding answers. The case closure brought administrative relief to law enforcement agencies that had devoted enormous resources to the investigation. But the emotional closure for families and community remained incomplete. Without a trial or formal legal resolution, the end felt arbitrary and unsatisfying. Case closed doesn't mean wounds healed, Sheriff White acknowledged during a brief statement to local media. This investigation consumed nearly a year of our department's time and resources, but more importantly, it represents a year of uncertainty and pain for people who deserve better. The evidence boxes contained hundreds of photographs, witness statements, forensic reports, and investigative notes that told the story of a thorough but ultimately tragic pursuit of justice. Ballistics evidence that had never matched a recovered weapon, DNA samples that had yielded no useful matches, digital forensics reports that had traced electronic footprints to dead ends. Marie McCann requested copies of the final investigative summary, wanting to understand every detail of how the case had been solved and why it had taken so long. Reading through the reports, she was struck by the dedication of investigators who had pursued every possible lead, but also frustrated by how many signs of Adam's guilt had been overlooked during the initial stages of the investigation. If someone had taken his confession seriously the first time he made it, how many months of agony could have been avoided? She wondered aloud to Lyle as they reviewed the timeline of events. The closed case file would eventually be stored with thousands of others in the Sheriff's Department archives, but for the families involved, the investigation's end marked the beginning of a different kind of work, learning to live with answers that satisfied legal requirements but left emotional questions unresolved. Justice, they had learned, was not the same thing as healing. Truth was not the same thing as peace. And closure was not a destination but an ongoing process that would continue long after the official paperwork was filed away. Summer 2022 brought an unexpected form of healing as friends and community members channeled their grief into creative memorials that would ensure Kylen and Crystal's story continued to touch lives. A group of local artists organized a mural project on the side of a downtown building, creating a vibrant tribute that captured the joy and love the couple had brought to Moab. Jessica stood on a ladder with paint-streaked hands, carefully adding details to Kylen's face that she remembered so well: the laugh lines around her eyes, the way her hair caught sunlight, the expression of pure happiness that had defined her personality. Working on the mural felt like spending time with her friend again, bringing back memories of their conversations and shared adventures. She would have loved this, Jessica said to Sean, who was painting Crystal's portrait with equal care and attention. Kylen always said art should make people feel something. I think this would make her feel proud. The mural depicted Kylen and Crystal in their favorite setting, surrounded by the red rock landscapes they had loved so much, their hands intertwined, their faces turned toward a sunset that would never end. Community members stopped by daily to watch the progress, often sharing their own memories of encounters with the couple. Other memorial projects bloomed throughout the town like wildflowers after rain. A memorial garden was planted in the city park, featuring native plants that would bloom in cycles throughout the year. Local businesses displayed photos and memory books where customers could share stories about interactions with Kylen and Crystal. The outdoor recreation community organized annual camping trips to honor their memory, choosing locations where the couple had been known to explore and find peace. These gatherings became celebrations of the wilderness lifestyle they had embodied, reminding participants to cherish both the beauty of natural places and the people who shared them. Lyle and Marie found comfort in these community efforts, grateful that their loved ones were being remembered not just as victims of crime, but as individuals who had contributed positively to many lives. The memorials transformed tragedy into something that could inspire others to love more boldly and live more fully. Autumn brought the first anniversary memorials that would become annual traditions in Moab, drawing visitors from throughout the region who had been touched by Kylen and Crystal's story. The candlelight vigil on October 18th filled the same community center where their memorial service had been held, but this gathering focused on celebrating their legacy rather than mourning their loss. "They taught us that love is brave," said one speaker, a young woman who had found courage to come out to her family after witnessing the couple's open, joyful relationship. "They showed our whole community what it looks like to live authentically, without apology or shame." The vigil featured speakers from across the spectrum of people whose lives had intersected with Kylen and Crystal's. Co-workers talked about their kindness and reliability. Customers remembered their patience and skill. Fellow members of the LGBTQ+ community spoke about the inspiration they had drawn from seeing a same-sex couple so fully accepted and celebrated in a small conservative town. Marie McCann had organized the memorial with help from friends, finding purpose in creating something beautiful from the wreckage of loss. She had spent weeks collecting photographs and stories, creating displays that showed Kylen and Crystal in all their complexity, not just as victims, but as fully realized human beings who had loved deeply and been deeply loved in return. The evening concluded with the release of memorial lanterns, each one carrying written messages to the couple. As dozens of lights rose into the October darkness, they seemed to carry more than just words. They lifted the accumulated grief of a community and transformed it into something that could ascend rather than drag spirits downward. Lyle watched the lanterns disappear beyond the mountains with tears streaming down his face, but for the first time since losing Kylen, they were not entirely tears of sorrow. Mixed in was something else: gratitude for the time they had shared, pride in the woman she had become, and determination to honor her memory through how he chose to live the rest of his life. The annual memorial would continue for years to come, each one drawing people who needed to remember that love persists even after tragedy, that communities can heal even after betrayal, and that light can emerge from the darkest circumstances. Winter's arrival brought the particular ache of holidays that would forever be marked by absence. Thanksgiving tables throughout Moab included empty chairs that had been quietly set in honor of family members who would never again share holiday meals. The simple act of setting a place became a ritual of remembrance that acknowledged loss while affirming continuing love. At the McCann family table, Kylen's chair remained in its usual spot between Lyle and Marie, decorated with a small arrangement of her favorite wildflowers. The family had debated whether the empty place setting would be too painful, but ultimately decided that excluding her would hurt more than including her memory in their celebration. She always insisted on making the cranberry sauce from scratch, Marie said quietly, as she served the traditional dish Kylen had contributed to family gatherings. She said the canned stuff was an insult to cranberries everywhere. Christmas brought its own challenges as families navigated the first holiday season without loved ones who had made the celebrations special. Crystal's family in Colorado struggled with decorating a tree that would have no presents underneath bearing her name, no phone calls on Christmas morning filled with her quiet laughter and expressions of gratitude. The broader Moab community rallied around grieving families with the kind of support that defines small-town life at its best. Neighbors delivered home-cooked meals, local businesses organized fundraising drives for memorial scholarships, and friends simply showed up when showing up was what was needed most. Snow fell heavily on the cemetery where both women were buried, creating a peaceful blanket that seemed to offer protection and rest. Lyle visited regularly throughout the winter, sometimes bringing flowers, sometimes just sitting in silence and talking to his daughter, as if she could hear him across whatever distance separated the living from the dead. "I miss your voice most of all," he said during one December visit, his breath creating small clouds in the cold air. "I keep thinking I'll hear you call from the other room, or laugh at something on television. The house is too quiet without you." The holidays eventually passed, but the lessons they taught about grief and endurance would last far longer than any season. Loss, the families learned, was not something to be overcome, but something to be carried with as much grace as possible. Spring 2022 marked a turning point when grief began transforming into purposeful action designed to help others facing similar losses. Marie McCann organized the first support group for families of crime victims, meeting monthly in the community center conference room to share experiences and coping strategies. "Grief is not something you get over," she told the group during their inaugural meeting. "It's something you learn to carry differently, but carrying it alone makes it heavier than it needs to be." The support group drew families from throughout southeastern Utah who had lost loved ones to violence and struggled with the unique challenges of traumatic loss. Unlike deaths from illness or accidents, murders left survivors with additional burdens: media attention, legal proceedings, and the knowledge that someone had deliberately chosen to end their loved one's life. Lyle found unexpected comfort in helping newly bereaved families navigate the practical challenges that followed violent death. He shared hard-won wisdom about dealing with investigators, managing media attention, and maintaining hope during long investigations. His own experience, as painful as it remained, became a resource for others walking similar paths. "The first thing I tell people is that it's going to be harder than you think and longer than you expect," he explained to a father whose son had been killed in a robbery. "But you're stronger than you know, and you don't have to face it alone." The support group also addressed the specific challenges faced by LGBTQ+ families dealing with hate crimes. Several members had lost loved ones to violence that seemed motivated by bias, and they worked together to advocate for better hate crime legislation and more comprehensive support services. Guest speakers included victim advocates, mental health professionals, and legal experts who helped group members understand their rights and access available resources. But the most valuable support came from other survivors who understood the particular texture of grief that follows murder. The monthly meetings became lifelines for people who had felt isolated in their pain, providing community for those whose loss made them feel separate from friends and neighbors who couldn't fully comprehend the magnitude of their experience. Summer 2022 brought the establishment of the Kylen and Crystal Memorial Foundation, a non-profit organization dedicated to supporting LGBTQ+ youth and promoting safety in outdoor recreation. The foundation's creation gave friends and family a concrete way to channel their ongoing grief into activities that would have made the couple proud. The foundation's first major initiative was a scholarship program for LGBTQ+ students pursuing careers in outdoor recreation, environmental science, or automotive technology fields that had been important to both women. The scholarships would be awarded annually at a ceremony coinciding with Pride Month, celebrating both academic achievement and the courage required to live authentically in communities that weren't always accepting. Kylen and Crystal never got to see how their story would inspire other young people, said Jessica, who had been elected to serve on the foundation's board of directors. But they would be amazed by how many kids have told us their relationship gave them hope for finding love and acceptance. The foundation also organized safety workshops for people who enjoyed camping and hiking, teaching basic personal protection skills without promoting fear of the outdoors. The workshops emphasized that isolated, recreation areas were statistically safe, but that reasonable precautions could further reduce risks. Local businesses enthusiastically supported the foundation's work, with many offering discounts or donations tied to memorial events. The outdoor recreation industry in particular embraced the opportunity to honor two people who had embodied the joy and freedom that drew so many people to wilderness activities. Annual fundraising events became highlights of Moab's social calendar, bringing together community members who might not otherwise interact. The foundation's charity runs attracted participants from throughout Utah and neighboring states, creating temporary communities of people united by shared values of acceptance and outdoor adventure. Marie McCann served as the foundation's president, finding purpose in work that transformed her personal loss into broader social good. "I can't bring them back," she said during the foundation's first annual dinner, "but I can make sure their deaths weren't meaningless. I can make sure other people get to live the kind of authentic, joyful lives they lived." August 18, 2022, marked exactly 2 years since the discovery of Kylen and Crystal's bodies, and the anniversary brought a pilgrimage of sorts to the mountain overlook where they had loved to watch sunsets together. Family members, friends, and supporters climbed the winding forest road to leave flowers, share memories, and find whatever peace could be found in the place where their story had ended. Lyle McCann stood at the edge of the overlook with a bouquet of wildflowers he had picked from roadside meadows during the drive up the mountain, the same flowers Kylen had loved to weave into impromptu crowns during their camping trips when she was younger. The gesture felt both inadequate and essential, too small to represent the magnitude of his love, but necessary for his own healing. "I brought your favorites," he said quietly, placing the flowers on a natural rock shelf that had become an informal memorial site. "The blue ones you always said looked like pieces of sky that fell to earth." Marie stood beside him with tears streaming down her face, but they were tears of gratitude as much as grief. 2 years of carrying this loss had taught her that love didn't end with death. It simply changed form, becoming memory and influence and inspiration rather than daily presence. The mountain overlook had become a place of pilgrimage for people throughout the region who had been touched by Kylen and Crystal's story. Flowers appeared regularly, left by visitors who had never met them but felt connected to their love story and tragic end. Messages written on stones or pieces of bark spoke to the universal human need to witness love and mourn loss. Crystal's mother had made the journey from Colorado, her first visit to the place where her daughter had died. She brought a mechanical part from the auto shop where Crystal had worked, a small token that represented her skill and dedication to her craft. "She could fix anything," Crystal's mother said as she placed the part beside the growing collection of memorial objects. "Everything except the thing that took her away from us." As the sun began to set over the mountains, the gathered group stood in comfortable silence, watching light fade from peaks that would outlast all human grief and joy. In that moment, surrounded by the landscape Kylen and Crystal had loved so much, their presence felt almost tangible, not gone, but transformed into something that could be carried forward by those who chose to remember. The wind through the pine trees carried whispers that might have been their names, or might have been the mountain's own voice, offering comfort to those who needed to believe that love persists beyond death, that memory can bridge any distance, and that some bonds cannot be broken by violence or time.